intro brief and then hand straight over to you, Paul.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right, perfect. Lovely. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for your patience in the waiting room. We'll be getting started in just a minute. I'm just waiting for the last couple of people to come in from the waiting room and join us. Lovely. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I would like to begin by first acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently broadcasting to you from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I am so pleased to be here with you all tonight for this special discussion of Monica Dux's new book, Lapsed. Before I hand you over to our speakers tonight so that we can get stuck into the discussion, I'd just like to really quickly first reiterate some of the information that you were sent in the email with your link to join us this evening. So as you've no doubt noticed, you have all automatically been placed on mute and you'll remain so throughout the evening. But that doesn't mean that we won't be taking questions. You can use the chat box to ask any questions that you have for Monica. They'll come straight through to me and I will read them out towards the end of the evening, provided that we have time to do so. If you can't see the chat box right now, then don't worry too much. I'm going to be using it to share the link that you can use to purchase your copies of Lapsed through us at Avid Reader. And when I do, it will pop up on your screen. So type those questions in there and they will come straight through to me. Last but not least, we rarely have any technical issues, but if we do, we will, and one of our speakers drops out tonight, then we will take a short break and get them readmitted to the Zoom room as soon as possible so that we can continue the conversation. If one of you happens to drop out, then don't worry either. Just use the same link that you used to join us now to reconnect, and I will make sure that I readmit you as soon as possible so that you don't miss anything. And so that's enough from me. I would now like to hand you over to Paul Barclay, who's recording this event for ABC Radio National and who will be taking things from here.
Thanks very much, Emma Kate. It's tremendous to be here, and thanks to Avid Reader. I thought I'd start with a bit of a story before I introduce our guest tonight, Monica Dux. A few years back when we were able to travel, I spent a month in Sicily. During this time, I visited Catania, the great Sicilian city at the foot of the active volcano of Mount Etna. It was coming up to February and the city was getting ready for its big annual festival, the Festival of St. Agatha, which commemorates the life of the city's patron saint. Agatha is, I found out in Catania, one of the most highly venerated Catholic martyrs. As the story goes, the 15-year-old Agatha made a vow of chastity and thereafter staunchly rejected the advances of an entitled Roman prefect. So insistent was Agatha not to give in to this man's demands that she endured the most unbearable torture. She was imprisoned and in the end had her breasts cut off with pincers, dying in prison sometime later, but of course, never losing faith in the church or confidence in God. That is the legend of St. Agatha. And when you travel to Catania at festival time, there are processions and you will find shops everywhere selling St. Agatha merchandise, including the very popular cakes made to look like her breasts, often with a little red cherry in the middle. Now, for me, this was right up there with one of the most bizarre and incomprehensible tourist experiences, but it just goes to show how deep Catholicism can run. Now, I say all of that as by way of introduction because coincidentally, it was also in Italy, in Rome, in fact, the eternal city, that our guest tonight, Monica Dux, experienced an entirely different, but to her similarly unnerving experience involving the Catholic Church, an experience we will talk about in just a moment. Monica is a good Catholic girl turned bad, a lapsed Catholic, but just as legend runs deep in Sicily, so too is Catholicism hard to entirely shake, even when you're a committed atheist. Monica's tremendous new book is called Lapsed, and she joins us now. Hello, Monica.
Hello, Paul.
Great to have you here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
So I just shared my traveller's tale from Sicily. Perhaps you can now share yours from Rome. You were visiting Rome and you were going, of course, to the grand Catholic churches, and you were in one of these churches and your daughter surprised you.
Yeah, she did. So as you said in the introductions, I was brought up entirely Catholic. Mass every Sunday, Catholic school. I wanted to be a nun. You know, I gave up Tim Tams for Lent, which is a bit of a big deal when I was a kid. And so I found myself in Rome with my thoroughly secular children. I hadn't baptized them. We talked about religion. We talked about religious tolerance. So there was this sense in my family, though, that religion was something that other people did, but not us. And we went into this beautiful church in the middle of Rome. And I was standing over the sarcophagus of St. Catherine of Siena, and her body was in there. And it was her body because her head is actually in Siena, which doesn't quite top those Agatha pastries with the nipples in them. But it was, so there's the beheaded saint there. I couldn't see my daughter. I turn around and there's, 6-year-old non-Catholic daughter praying. And I went up to her and I was like, "Oh, what are you doing?" And she was like, "Oh, is this how you do it? Is this how you pray?" And, she'd never seen me pray. I mean, she must have seen people pray in the movies, but she'd never been into a church as far as I could remember in Australia. So I was really taken aback by this. And I thought, oh, she's just kind of cute. She's just doing what she thinks she should do here. Anyway, later that day, we're heading to the Vatican, and I want to be Catholic. I'm Catholic. And her brother told her that she just needed a bit of water thrown on her and that would make her Catholic. And she just suddenly became this little convert for Christ. And it was, like at that age, a 6-year-old, they're always searching for meaning. I got that. I didn't want to bring up my children and say, there is no God. It was like, well, of course we all try and find our purpose in life. And children at that age are doing that in a very, very heartfelt way. So that shouldn't have bothered me, but I was so troubled by the fact she wanted to actually be Catholic. I was absolutely conflicted and confused, to the point that later that day I actually thought about baptizing her in the bath in our Airbnb. And so look, it was really confronting. And I'd always felt very Catholic, but I thought I'd left it behind, and I had a lot of very angry feelings about the Catholic Church. I had a lot of a real sense that my Catholic identity had shadowed me. But when she actually expressed this desire to be Catholic, it was like I was looking at a mirror, and I thought, I really need to look into this, because my response to it was possibly some would think was disproportionate to what was actually going on. Yeah.
Look, we'll talk about many of the things that you spoke about there, your Catholic upbringing, how you moved away from the church, what motivated it, and all of that. But just sticking with your daughter for a moment, this incident was the trigger, really, for this book that you've written, was it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a real, it was my flash of deconverting light, perhaps. I was completely, I think I'd always known that there was a part of me that was Catholic, and I'd always felt like lapsed Catholics, former Catholics, ex-Catholics were people who I really related to, and that we all seemed to share this strange identity that I hadn't put my finger on. And I had thought about it for a long time, and it was always sort of there. I was like the ex-Catholic. In my share houses, I had a religious iconography on my walls, ironically. I was the one that everyone would get the good kind of Catholic humor out of. And so it had always been there. But when she decided to convert, at least, for a time, it did sort of bring it all back to me. And I thought, I'm a middle-aged woman, and I thought that I stopped believing in God in my late teens. I really wanted to figure it out. And I wanted to speak to all the people out there like me, because I felt I had so many years of having conversations with other lapsed ex-former angry Catholics, and we never quite knew who we were or why we were, but we all knew there was this thing that had stuck to us. And having your child want to be Catholic was probably up there with the worst thing that she could possibly have asked to do at that age. Probably on par with getting a tattoo. 16.
Kind of ironic though, Monica, because she's a young child, and as you say, there is something understandable about someone young wanting to believe in something big and all-powerful, perhaps like God. And of course, you at that age were completely and utterly immersed in this world. Yet, when your daughter presents as having an interest in this, you're aghast. It's a kind of irony, isn't it?
Yeah, and it really struck me, possibly, as I was researching the book, and the more I was looking into it and examining Catholic belief and my own place in it, the big problem for me was church abuse. I think if what had happened in that church 50 years before, and I had lapsed and I didn't believe in God anymore, but my daughter wanted to be Catholic, I think my reaction might have still been a little bit like, oh, hang on, that's not what we do. That's not us. But it wouldn't have been as violent. But there was so much conflict I had been carrying in me, not just about losing a religion, which I think anyone who grows up religious and then walks away from it will always carry that with them, because that's your community, that's your family, that's a whole belief system that you sort of discard. It wasn't just about that. It was a lot to do, I think, with how do I say to her, I have these issues with the church that go beyond just whether there's a God or not, or the particular God. I mean, I was there saying to her months later, there's other gods, or you could be a different kind of, like there's lots of, but just not this one. Just leave this one alone, because I haven't figured that one out, and I'm really angry. And I didn't, you can't say to a 6-year-old, well, the Catholic Church committed these abominations. Like I just, it's not that simple. And that was the conflict that I think it's a conflict that most just Catholics and former Catholics struggle with all the time now.
Yeah, and all this from someone who wanted to be a nun at the age of 12 at high school.
Absolutely.
What was all that about, Monica?
Well, I was so curious about me wanting to be a nun, because I really wanted to be a nun. I mean, I was going to heaven, and there was a real economy, I think, when I was 12 to being the idea of being a nun, because I thought, well, if it's all true, which of course it was in my mind, why would you risk earthly temptation to possibly go to hell and get it wrong? Much better to just lock yourself in a convent and spend your time praying to God, because then you get all the prizes later once you die. So I mean, that sort of made sense to me, but it had always intrigued me as an adult and as an atheist as an adult, that, well, why would I have wanted, why would a child in the 1980s have wanted to not have sex, live in poverty, have no real control over my life, and wear really dowdy clothes? And I was growing up in this 80s pop culture, and it always intrigued me. And I always thought that it was just me who wanted to be a nun, and that maybe there were a few others like me out there. But when I was writing the book, I put a call out on social media asking, who wanted to be a nun, and it was like this tsunami of women saying, yeah, I wanted to be a nun. Even women who'd grown up and hadn't been Catholic. I wanted to be a nun too. Men, I wanted to be a nun. But there were just so many. And so I wanted to answer in the book. I suddenly thought, well, why did we want to be a nun? And I think there is something when I researched this and I looked into it, there's something very particularly Catholic about the Catholic way of seeing the world that made the idea of being a nun so attractive. But it was something I hadn't really understood before I researched the book. And that was part of what my journey was trying to figure those things out, to say, why would those things appeal?
Yeah. I mean, your book is a way of seeking to understand what all of this means, this devotion to Catholicism at a young age, this fact that you're in a family that is very much a Catholic family, yet here you are rejecting all of it, completely and utterly rejecting it. The Jesuits famously brag, don't they? Give me a child until he is 7 and I will give you the man. You're a woman, but do you think that early diet of Catholicism has shaped you to the point where you have retained a lot of that?
Yeah, I do. And that was one of the questions that I set out with the book, trying to work out, because my brother and I had often, as adults, joked that there were things we saw as very Catholic, and we called it the Catholic, oh, that's the Catholic when a person does that. And there were all these sort of quirks and foibles and funny little things that we we did, and we saw in ourselves, and I could see in, you know, people who were brought up like Catholic like me, and who no longer believed in the church, but it was these strange little behaviors. And I set out researching the book thinking, I want to figure out what those things are. I want a definitive answer. And then maybe if I figure all that out, then I could probably just unpack it all and get rid of it. But what was interesting at the end of the journey, I was like, well, of course, there's no simple answer to this. But I do think, I mean, in terms of the way that the Catholic Church imprints on you, when you're a child, I mean, prayer ritual is very powerful. And I mean, I still find myself praying when things have gone really wrong in my life. I'll do a few Hail Marys, and it calms me down. And I think there's some really interesting brain science that looks into that very question and says, I think Catholic children and Catholicism is a very particular kind of religion that it involves so much ritual and so much repetition that gets in under your skin. But there's also a whole lot of Catholic ideas about who you are, about sin, about, you know, your sense of worthiness, and about the miraculous all around you. I mean, you talk about Agatha in your introduction. That sort of thing seems funny kind of now, but when you're growing up, like, they're our superheroes. These people are real. You know, we have pictures all around us of these saints suffering. And so all that magical thinking, all that ritual, and that very, I mean, I look at my daughter now, and I was thinking this the other day, that when I was 7, I had to go and sit in a room with a man I didn't know very well, and I was a bit scared of. And I had to say all these words that I'd learned, and I had to tell him about my sins. I had to think that I, at 7, had been a bad person in some way, and God needed to forgive me. And the idea now that I would have put my 7-year-old in a room with a man telling them how bad she was. I mean, and I think so all of that, I think that whole Catholic experience, it shapes you regardless of.
So that's the structural stuff, isn't it? And the church kind of structures, and also there's the institutional abuse, which is just unspeakably terrible and has ruined countless lives. But is that enough to explain why you left behind religion entirely, Catholic religion entirely? I mean, was this a process of you just bit by bit finding that you didn't believe anymore, and when you found out the extent of this institution and how it had been abusing people, that was the kind of final straw?
Not entirely. I mean, I think most former Catholics have experienced it in a similar way. I mean, my journey, I think, is pretty typical. Not everyone goes and writes a book about it, but most adolescents, if you're brought up religious, by adolescence, it's generally when you start questioning things. Just as, you know, when you're a child, you tend to believe. And, you know, studies show it's in adolescence that people are more likely to walk away from a childhood religion. Sometimes they come back, but, you know, that's generally where you start shaping your grown-up views. And so on one hand, for me, when I was growing up, in my adolescence, I did stop believing in God. It just started to seem a bit nonsensical. It didn't really stick, and it frayed. And I didn't, it wasn't like I had, I mean, deconversion, when people stop believing in things, we imagine conversion as being this flash of light, but deconversion is a very slow process. And so there was the belief in the higher being that left me. But then, yes, there was the institution that I lost faith with, and that I started to feel a great deal of conflict about. And I mean, the anger I in terms of church abuse, that was something that, even though it was all around us, it wasn't really until my 20s that it started, you know, the 90s and the noughties, when all these revelations came out. But I had a lot of anger before then. I mean, because Catholicism is a very strict religion with very arcane and rules about your body, for instance. And so for me as a teenager, a big trigger was, you know, sex and contraception, and suddenly thinking, this does not add up. And desire, you know, this idea of what I could do with my desires, which are very, you know, Catholic ideas about how you can love and who you can love and what you can do with that. And so that sense of what the institution was telling me, even if a lot of Catholics, well, most Catholics don't do a lot of those things, but that was another form of deconversion. But so, yeah, the belief in God was one thing, and I think I could have experienced that having grown up in any religion, but the institution That was the big one. And I guess that's where decades on, I've come around to saying that's the thing that really we need to confront, you know.
Absolutely. I was, as I was reading your book, I was realizing that many of the countries around the world that I visited and loved so much were actually Catholic countries. And I was thinking of a time, a number of years ago when I was in Dublin, and the movie Spotlight was screening. This is the film about the Boston Globe, the investigative journalism that uncovers this widespread systemic child sex abuse in Boston amongst the Roman Catholic priests there. And Ireland, of course, had already had countless numbers of similar cases. And here I am in Dublin watching this movie about Catholic child sex abuse in a staunchly Catholic country, thinking to myself, how are Catholics here processing it in this country that's so deeply rooted in Catholicism? Now, you've done some research on this. Do we know how many Catholics have disaffiliated from the church because of this, or do we know the extent of
within
it?
Ireland?
Actually, Ireland and other countries similar.
The whole world.
Countries, yeah.
I'll have a map of the world behind me, and we can go through one by one. We'll just bypass Poland and South America. Ireland's a fascinating case because for two reasons, I think. One is that Australian Catholics, a lot of us have Irish roots, and Irish Catholicism is a very particular kind of Catholicism, but they didn't sing because they were so oppressed. So it's harsher. I mean, some would say that's a cliche, but I think there's some truth in that. So we have a history. I mean, my own Catholicism comes from an Irish Catholic heritage. In Ireland, what's so interesting is that there's an ethnic identity there, and it's very political to be Catholic when you're Irish, and it's really hard to separate that history. So, I mean, in terms of what's happened in Ireland in recent years, I mean, they had the Ryan Commission, they had their own investigations into clergy abuse, they had the Magdalene laundries. There's a tremendous groundswell against the church. And that is really interesting. I mean, now they legalized abortion with certain limits. A while back, an interesting kind of contrast is when Pope John Paul II visited in 1979, like over 1 million people, and it's a small country, turned out to see him. When Francis visited, it was, really low, a couple of 100,000 or something. So Ireland, most European Catholic countries, other than Poland, which is a completely different kettle of fish, and the US and UK and Australia, masses of people have turned away from Catholic Church. Institutional religion as well, but Catholicism is one that has lost tremendous. I mean, in Australia in the mid-50s, 3/4 of Catholics would go to Mass every week. In 2011, it was something like just over 10%. So, and that I suspect that would be lower. So, I mean, in Australia, the fastest growing belief is actually non-belief. That was in our last census. So all across the world, or the Western world, I'd say, there has been a moving away from the church, and Catholicism has been hit particularly hard. And the abuse scandals have had a lot to do with that, but I don't think that's the entire story there. Yeah.
You spoke to survivors of institutional sex abuse. What did they tell you about? Well, I mean, the sense of betrayal, for one thing, of the church. This, institution and this belief that obviously was, for many of them, very important to them at one stage in their life.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really hard one, and it was really difficult writing that chapter where I talked about the abuse in the church, because I felt that, how do I tell that story when I'm not a survivor of church abuse? But it always felt to me that, all Catholics and all former Catholics were implicated in this abuse, and survivors and victims of church abuse are very much at the epicenter of that. But there's some really interesting stuff written about that idea of spiritual trauma, that when it's not just about abuse that's occurred in an institution, which does happen in other institutions, it's when it's done by someone who's meant to be a messenger for God. And what Catholic Church has done, it was systematic, the cover-ups, the lack, even today, the lack of real acknowledgement of what has occurred. that's just, it's so huge. And I think one thing I came around to realizing was, if you have endured that from the church, there's a sense of, well, what do other Catholics do as allies? You know, how do we, because it's so unresolved, and it's, yeah. So I think that is a real. And what really struck me, I guess the biggest thing that struck me when I was writing the book, is that I knew about abuse that occurred. I knew people who had been abused by the church, but so many people I spoke to, lapsed Catholics, former Catholics, and they all had a story, or they all had a suspicion. And that was actually what was more devastating, I think. It wasn't just, oh yes, there's this, you know, my uncle had this happen. It was, I think something happened to my cousin. I think something might have happened. He went to this school and this happened. And that for me was everywhere, you know, and you would find that if you push people, they all sort of had a story. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I guess that.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's the experience of people of my generation, friends of mine who went to Catholic primary schools and high schools, who would not fit the definition of being abused, and who you know, who don't claim to have been sexually abused, but certainly will just tell you stories routinely of the cruelty of the church on a daily basis.
Oh, and it's funny how many stories come out of just that sense of, like nuns and priests and brothers just crossing lines all the time. And I think if you went to a Catholic school or you were brought up Catholic, some people say, oh, I never saw that, I never felt that, but there's often something there. And I think, I mean, when it comes to priests, for instance, there's this hierarchy in the church. It's an extremely hierarchical organization. It's this massive patriarchy. And I mean, it's embedded into the whole culture of the church. And in schools, I think that sort of behavior is just, it's epidemic.
One of the things I found out reading your book is that so common are ex-Catholics that there's a kind of sociology of lapsed Catholicism going on, people who study this for a living. Tell us some of the things you discovered when you looked into this. What are some of the perhaps common characteristics that lapsed Catholics share?
Yeah, I'd say that was fascinating, because there is, I mean, the study of religion is huge. After World War II, you know, a whole lot of new social sciences came in, of course, and religion was a big one. And for decades, it was all about, you know, people believing. And it wasn't as much, well, people not believing. People who didn't believe, or who were atheists, or who had left religion, were seen as a little bit kind of cuckoo. You know, there was something not quite right about that. And in recent decades, it's very interesting that there's so much more academic interest now in what people believe when they no longer believe. And of course, there's so many research subjects out there when it comes to Catholicism, because there's so many people who don't believe. But I was frustrated with a lot of the research I was reading, because there's a lot of very dry studies about numbers and about statistics. And I really wanted to find out, that perfect study. You know, you always dream you're going to find this wonderful research project that someone spent years working on, and then you can just use it for your own purposes, and thank them in the acknowledgements. I wanted to find the thing that said, here are the characteristics of a lapsed Catholic. And I thought, well, I'll start and look at what are the characteristics of a Catholic, and then I can figure out what the lapsed Catholic is. There wasn't much there at all. I mean, one of the big things that came through, which really struck me, and I referred to earlier, was that sense of the divine all around us, how Catholics do have a very particular way of seeing the world. And I think that to me resonated, that, oh, I see a sign. Oh, it's a sign. I just know that someone's speaking to me. I think that happens a lot for lapsed Catholics. I think I could see in myself and people I knew this sense of our relationship to money. And I think Catholics do, this sense of what money is to Catholics is very different to Protestants. And so there's this character, this self-abasement was there. That my research into women and nuns and Mary, the figure of Mary, that idea that we must be constantly unworthy, I think seeps in. So there was all of that, but I couldn't find that definitive answer. It was very frustrating, but I did end up finding a fellow in Ireland who did this fantastic study on lapsed Catholics. And he did a research project where essentially he said that he was frustrated as well by a lot of the research on lapsed Catholics was essentially, are you Catholic, tick that box, or are you not Catholic, tick that box. He said it was this binary always, but he was like, but none of these studies showed how Catholic people felt or how Catholic they were. And he said, so instead of asking his research subjects, are you Catholic, to begin with, yes or no, he sat them down and he said, did a free association, and he got them to list, all these Irish former Catholics, to list all the things they associated with the Catholic Church. And he said, top of the list was pedophilia. And then you got things like authoritarianism and corruption and all these negative associations. And he said, and so when he asked them whether they were Catholic or not, in this representative sample, they were less likely to call themselves Catholic. He said, I broke that ethnic link. And once he'd done that, he said, I could then look at, well, how do they see themselves as no longer Catholic? So, I mean, ultimately, though, I guess the thing I saw as the thing that does unite all us lapsed Catholics is our sense of separateness. We grew up with a very specific worldview. We did these we repeated these rituals. We carry this legacy. We feel different. And I think if you bring it right down to its core, that was for me the answer. We feel like we are separate to the world.
Yes. Yeah, well, friends of mine who possibly no longer believe a lot of the teachings and rarely go to church, maybe Christmas time. Some of them I suspect would be the people who would tick the box in the census. They would describe themselves as cultural Catholics. That in a sense, there is something about Catholicism that transcends the theology. There's something about the community that they can't quite bring themselves to say that they're no longer a part of, and so they cling on. Is that something you can relate to?
Oh, absolutely. And I think I've been doing that for decades. I would get defensive at university if someone, would make a Catholic joke. I mean, you don't hear many Catholic jokes anymore, but this idea of there were Protestants and then there were Catholics. And I did carry with me, and now I see this as kind of a bit silly, really, but I carried with me that sectarian legacy that my parents lived through, because my father was an Anglican. So I always had these stories of what the Anglicans had done and the Catholics had done, and the Catholics were always the goodies and the Anglicans were the baddies. So I always had this sense of this separateness and this thing that I was brought up in, and the fact that people I met who had a similar childhood to me felt comfortable, and we all seemed to relate. We all seemed to share jokes about things. We all understood a certain language that other people didn't understand. I got to the end of my book, and I didn't know I would get there, but I got to the end of my book and thought, that's a distraction, because it's all very nice. And this is what this lovely Hugh Turpin, the academic in Ireland who did that study, Breaking the Ethnic Link, he said to me that he realized, and he could see this, that in his research, that there were kind of two types of lapsed Catholics, if you kind of pare it down. And one were those who he called harmonious. They embraced an ethic of harmony, and they would baptize their kids, because even if they didn't believe in God, and they would maybe go to mass at Christmas, and they would send them to Catholic school, and they would do all these things just because it's easier and it pleases grandma. And then he said the other type of lapsed Catholics are what he called the ethic of authenticity. So I started calling them the authentics. And these are Catholics who say, I cannot stand by this institution that hasn't just abused children, but has had appalling record and continues to have an appalling record for LGBTQ plus people. That's transphobic. That's that has caused untold damage. That doesn't want you to use a condom, and that has done these abominable crimes.
This is the category you're in.
Well, and this was, I think I'd always sort of been dancing around that category, and both of them. And when I spoke to him, it was like, that's the category. That's the category as a lapsed Catholic. And that's an active, positive choice. And so, I think that sense of being a cultural Catholic and I still see myself as very Catholic, and I know it's imprinted on me. But after writing the book and researching and talking to as many people as I could and looking into the history, I thought, no, I have to make that positive choice and say, I'm not participating. because, and I'm not going to tick Catholic on the census because it feels like, oh yeah, I'm a bit Catholic. And yeah, and that was the big, and I guess that was what I wanted to do when I wrote the book, was get that conversation started for people to say, actually, what is my relationship to the church and to belief? And is baptizing my children if I don't believe in God and I get so angry at the institution such a great idea?
Yeah, so by doing that, you're turning your back on something big, a big view, even if it is a view that you can no longer subscribe to, and you're instead embracing atheism, which is a view that, you know, we live, we die, what we do in our life matters, but there is nothing at the end of it. Do you feel that in taking that step, did you feel a sense that you'd lost something? Did you feel there was a gap, a void that presented itself after you'd made this decision?
In terms of being an authentic lapsed, or in terms
in terms of no longer believing, when once you did, and I appreciate this is a kind of a phased period of lapsing rather than a kind of moment of clarity. At the end of it, is there something, even though you can no longer believe, is there something in you that makes you wish that you could still subscribe to this?
Oh yeah, I mean, look, I wish there was a lovely God. Like, of course we do. I mean, I wish that there was an Easter bunny and that Santa Claus was real. Like, I mean, you want these things. I think that one thing that happens when I was an adolescent, it certainly happened and took a long time. I think there's a tremendous amount of grief in leaving religion. And I think the grief that children brought up religious, not just Catholic, if they walk away from the church, the grief isn't just about the big man in the sky. It's also about community, and it's about, I guess, your trust in your parents. I mean, you rebel against your parents, but to suddenly think that what they did to you and when they taught you, no matter how much you love them, you completely reject that. That's very confronting. And I think I grieved religion, like not having a God for years. And I think that is quite common. I also think if I look back now, I probably didn't really quite believe I didn't believe for a lot longer than I would have said I didn't believe. You know, I would have at 21 said, oh, I don't believe in God. But I think a part of me did. And I thought when I was writing Lapsed, because I was reading a lot about church history, and some of it's very beautiful, you know, and courageous and heroic. And I thought maybe by the end of this, I might believe a bit more. And in the end, I think I became more of an atheist writing this book, because the more I looked at history and culture and belief, and the battles, you know, and the looking at Christianity, not just from a 2,000-year perspective, but from, you know, 4,000 years of an evolution of ideas, you do start to think, in a way, it was a bit of an accident of history. You know, this is the one that rose to the top. Yeah, and so I believed a lot less. But of course, I mean, I think if there was someone who was, if I could see my father again, I would give anything for that. You know, we all would. Yeah. I can't see who wants to cease to exist unless they're very unhappy. Yeah.
Yeah, true. And as you alluded to there is a lot in the book about religious history and theology. Very interesting for those of us who are not schooled in any of this. And I put myself in that category. I learned a lot. And there's a lot about Jesus, which I found really interesting. What did you learn about Jesus as an historical figure, as distinct from, say, a divine figure? Because Jesus has come to represent something bigger than the individual religious denominations in which he's present.
Yeah, look, Jesus is amazing. Jesus is amazing, but Jesus is amazing. When you study him, so my question in the book about Jesus, I knew I had to look at Jesus, but the problem for me when I was growing up is I didn't actually love him. And post-Vatican II children,
you never loved him.
I never loved him, and I tried so hard to love him. And you know, there's that awful Bettina Arndt book where she talks about, you get in the canoe, if you don't feel like having sex with your husband, you get in the canoe and eventually you'll be really into it. And I think part of me wanting to be a nun was that I would get into the canoe of nundom and somehow I would magically end up loving Jesus, as so many, you know, mystics and saints had loved him quite suspiciously, but in the past. And so, yeah, so Jesus just, I couldn't love him, and I thought, well, who is this Jesus? But as an adult, I was very interested in the way that Jesus is the everyman. He's the good everyman. And I noticed over the years when I was talking to lapsed Catholics who were sending their kids to Catholic school, you'd say, oh, how do you feel about sending them to Catholic school? You don't believe, you're angry at the church. And they'd say, oh yeah, I don't like their views on, on gay people, but Jesus said some really good things and I would like them to have that. And this comes up, and outside of Catholicism, whenever a political figure does something terrible, it's like, Jesus, you say you're a Christian, that's not what Jesus would want. And the what would Jesus do question.
Yep.
It's as if he's such a rubbery figure these days. And so I thought, well, is he?
He's a social justice warrior in some people's minds as well.
Oh, he's everything. I mean, he's a real cool guy. Like that song, that King Missile song from the 90s. I was just like, that's it. Like, Jesus walked on water. That's so cool. Everyone loves Jesus, right? You can't not love Jesus. People will, Stephen Fry rails against God. Richard Dawkins rails against God. Richard Dawkins actually said at one point that Jesus would be an atheist if he was here today because he was so cool. Like, this is where we've got to with Jesus. So I read about Jesus, and it was fascinating because there is just so much debate about who he was, because there was such scant evidence that he even existed. And I thought maybe he didn't exist. And there is a school of thought that says he did exist. I think it's very likely. The academic consensus, even from people who, hate everything about religion, will say Jesus most likely existed. But exactly who was he? And there's no consensus on that. But what there is, I think, is an understanding today that we've turned him into a great guy. And what I learned from my long time with Jesus was that I don't think he was such a great guy. I mean, I think, and I ended up speaking to this Reza Aslan, who wrote this fantastic book called Zealot. It was a bestseller. He was a very smart man, very interesting. And he talked about Jesus as a historical figure. And he completely contextualized Jesus, the man in his era. And his argument, which is, he coalesced a lot of other thinkers on this, that Jesus was really basically an activist, angry at Rome. He was one of many other zealots, and he wasn't that remarkable as a zealot, but because of the turn of history, he's the one who we all worship. And
I love that you ask him whether or not Jesus would be a decent dinner party guest. And he says, no, he wouldn't be. He'd be an angry religious fanatic.
Oh yeah, because I thought, well, that's kind of the test, isn't it? Because everyone would say, because everyone says, oh, if I had dinner party guests, well, I'd have Virginia Woolf, and then there would be Jesus, of course. And it's like, yeah, I said to him, yeah, what would you think? And no, you don't want to have Jesus at your fantasy dinner party. Like, he would not be very good company. And he said, he was a true believer in his view, and from his reading of it, he was a true believer. But there's a whole lot of other really interesting discussion about the fact that what we read into the Gospels and how we hear these Jesus say great things like love one another, which is a really nice idea. Jesus said some really nasty things too. Like, it wasn't all great. But we tend to just look at the nice stuff. And in a way, I felt that Jesus was this get out of jail free card for belief, because I love the idea of Jesus. And I mean, I say in the book, I watched the little drummer boy, that little claymation stop motion every year, and I sob, because at the end, in the manger and the stars, and then it's like, blessed are they, they shall see God. All this idea of goodness is so beautiful in a figure. But I thought what we tend to do, and it's that going back to those people who would say to me, I am angry at the church, or my sister was abused, but I'm still going to send my kid to a Catholic school because Jesus said some nice things. And I thought, don't use him. He's kind of become something that I don't think he was, but also I think he's the get out of jail free card for us lapsed Catholics.
Yeah, we've got all this way through the discussion and we haven't really spoken about sex. Well, not sex as pleasure. I imagine as a Catholic schoolgirl, you were taught about self-control and denial of pleasure and suffering and all of those things. Which of course don't involve sex. Then you write though about well and truly discovering sex when you're at university. How did Catholicism affect your attitudes and approach to sex?
Well, I mean, of course, Catholic ideas about sex are very strange, I think, for a contemporary audience. I mean, they're very, and I wanted, that was like all my other chapters in the book. With sex, I really wanted to understand why I was told in year 9 that if I was having a shower and I washed myself down there, that was, and I enjoyed it, it was sinful. I shouldn't do that. I was told this by my biology teacher, who was also a nun. And I'd been told, you can't have sex before marriage. And this idea of desire being this really dangerous thing. And, there's this cliche that Catholics are obsessed with sex. And it was funny when I went to uni and I found myself studying the history of sexuality, and I was obsessed with sex in an intellectual sense, that I was told, and I have been told often, I was working for an academic and she said, oh, all you Catholics are into the history of sexuality. It's just, and I mean, Anne Summers, a great feminist, of course, she was brought up Catholic. Germaine Greer was Catholic. I think that sense of what we can do to our bodies and how you can use your body and how you can use desire. And I think anyone brought up Catholic is taught. I mean, what's interesting is when you look at something, and this isn't necessarily sex, but it's about sex, is contraception. And when the Humana Vitae was published in the late 60s by the Pope, and he said you can never use artificial contraception, it's evil, Catholics actually use contraception at the same rate, practicing Catholics, pretty much at the same rates as non-Catholics. And the same would be true, I suspect, for sex. The majority of actual devout Catholics are likely to be having sex before marriage, which is a big no-no. And so, yeah, I looked into that because I thought, well, why is the church so obsessed with it? Because I was certainly really fascinated by it. And it was amazing because it's like, yes, there are real reasons that the church has these very strange ideas 2,000 years later or 3,000 years later, because a lot of the ideas that the Catholic Church has about sex sort of predate Christianity in a way. There's all this Gnostic idea of the flesh and the spirit and what is base and what is good. But it's still, for me, once again, like so much of what I researched in the book, I thought this stuff is really out there. I mean, you had great minds, and like seriously great minds, not just, church thinkers in the Middle Ages debating over and over whether if a man has sex with a woman but does not ejaculate, is he actually having sex with her and sinning? And this is like, there are books on this, and the way that it was as if, Augustine of Hippo, like the great church founding father, and I mean, he's responsible for a lot of Catholic ideas about sex, but the figuring out of what do you do with desire and what do you do with your body, and it's a very ancient figuring out, and it's persisted, and the Catholic institution today is so steadfast in its ideas about sex and sexuality. And for many people, they're not just offensive or nonsensical, they're also very traumatic. Yeah. I mean, they've kind of updated ideas about, and I'm using their term, homosexual acts. It's okay to be gay. And I've heard this a lot from other conservative Catholics. It's okay to be gay, but you're just not meant to have sex. And, all of that is still there in the institution. And even if people feel as if, oh, well, we just don't do what they tell us, it's still what it is to actually be, under church canon law, a good Catholic. And yeah, so sex is huge for Catholics. Like that, yeah, I reaffirmed that.
Well, of course, the Catholic Church opposed same-sex marriage. They opposed homosexuality in general, the ordination of women, euthanasia, abortion. Many of these things that the Catholic Church has stood against are actually, according to opinion polls, things that the majority of Australians believe in. It must be hard for Catholics who stay within the fold and who don't hold these views that the church propounds to sit back and watch the church lobby governments on these issues. I mean, presumably the church doesn't have the influence though it once had in this area?
Well, no, not entirely. But then again, arguably people were having sex just as much before, 50, 100 years ago. Catholics were. They just, it was just a bit uglier when things went wrong, I guess. I think when I was researching the book, I was very clear that I didn't want to say to Catholics who believe this is what you should believe, right? I was talking to lapsed Catholics because I feel that that was my audience in a way. But for Catholics who do believe, a lot of Catholics, a lot of Catholics actually are really appalled by a lot of what the church says and does, and are really appalled by what the Vatican says. And going back to what I was saying about contraception, the fact that contraceptive use is pretty much level for devout Catholics and non-Catholics really says what people are doing. There's that. And that's one thing to say, oh, well, people are working from within and people want to keep, their faith. And I respect that. But I think what was very clear to me in so many instances when I was researching the book was there are instances in recent history, and there will continue to be, where actually those ideas have caused tremendous harm, not just emotional harm, not just harm to people feeling like their community has rejected them or that they're being judged. But, instances like years ago in 2000, I think it's 2008 or 2009, a woman in Ireland who was miscarrying, and the hospital wouldn't give her a termination and she died, which actually ended up sparking their reforms on abortion. But you have many cases in Argentina recently. At the end of last year, they legalized abortion with a lot of caveats once again. And that was a battle that was going on for years, but women were just dying, and wherever you go around the world, to Catholic countries or where there's a Catholic influence, you will see real damage done. I mean, the HIV/AIDS situation in the African continent, during the 80s and 90s, and the statements that came out of the Vatican about, and the misinformation that came out of the Vatican, I'd add, about condom use. I mean, I've read books, Catholic, literature that talking about how there's microscopic holes in condoms where the AIDS your virus gets through. So there is the idea of, okay, how do you your beliefs and the institution, if you believe in all of it, well, then you work that out. But I think there's very real harm that the institution has done, and that can't be sort of ignored. That stuff is the stuff that really matters. It's just not about personal belief.
You seem to want a sense of finality about having left the church, confirmation that you've permanently departed. But you find it's rather like the Hotel California song. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's where I sort of started after my daughter's conversion. I started looking into, well, how do I officially leave? As a first place, I thought I'll just begin the book by telling people, well, if you actually do want to check out, this is how you do it. And I spent a long time researching how you would do that. And the answer is actually, according to the Catholic Church, no, you can't. Once you've actually been baptized, it's irrevocable. And there is no mechanism within Catholic canon law to understand deconversion. In fact, I spoke to a canon lawyer who had looked into this issue, and he said that they don't even use the word member. There is no sense that as a Catholic you're a member. You become part of something, and that can never be broken. And excommunication, a lot of people I spoke to would say, oh, well, you can get excommunicated. And excommunication is medicinal. It's like being suspended or put in the sin bin during a match. It's not being expelled.
Oh, is that right?
No, excommunication is not the way to get out. In fact, it just means they're not going to give you communion and you've been very naughty. So, I mean, so Henry VIII was still a Catholic when he died, according to the Catholic Church, or like Martin Luther was still a Catholic when he died, according to Catholic Church. And so
Joan of Arc, perhaps. Fidel Castro was excommunicated, apparently. Still a Catholic, though, when he died.
Yeah, that was just him getting a note to take home to his mum to say he'd been really bad. So the church doesn't see that. What was interesting to me was how many people like me out there became activists in trying to separate from the church. And there are ways that you can. It takes a lot of work and it's very hard, but you can get your baptismal certificate, for example, in the parish you were baptized in, annotated to say she no longer considers herself part of the church. And there's all those ways, but ultimately the church sees you as theirs. And I think that for some people and some former Catholics, they say, well, I don't care what they think. But for some people, it really mattered. And that to me, I think was a real symptom of why it shows that there's this dissatisfaction and this tension in our relationship to the church, and a need to really make that somehow official. And so you will find throughout the world, there's one in Ireland, there's in Argentina, in Malta, even these activist groups that were actually set up to help people officially leave the church. And then, there's often debate online about, well, how do you do this? But the awful simple answer is actually they're not going to do it for you, and they're not going to give you a certificate. And so it's sort of up to us. And that was where I came round to at the end, thinking, I think there are things you can do to separate from the church, but that's actually something you need. But the idea that they're going to un-Catholic you is just never going to happen.
So does being an atheist leave any room for spiritualism in your life?
Yeah. I mean, I think life, we all.
Well, do you feel like you don't need it? I don't know. Yeah.
No. I mean, I find I actually, when I was writing the book, I kept thinking, I've really got to figure out this death thing, because I want to die well and I want to be at peace with my death. And I think that's something every human, every sentient being, even maybe my dog, grapples with it. No, I mean, death. And when my father was dying, watching him die, it was very. I had this terrible moment with him where my father, being an Anglican, had a much nicer God, I realized at the end. And my father was a very lovely man, and he was very graceful, and he went very well. But when he was dying in those last few days, so his brother had died and had wanted to wear his glasses, had said, put my glasses on after I die so I can see my mother in heaven. And when my father was dying and lying there, I really wanted to say to him, oh, Dad, you're going to see God, and I'll put your glasses on. And I found it was quite an awful moment, thinking, I can't say that to him. I can't tell him it will be okay. And, that's something every human being grapples with. So I don't. Do
you think he wanted you to say something like that?
No, I don't, because I think he understood himself well enough to not need his daughter to do that for him. He wasn't panicked or desperate, I don't think. I mean, dying isn't pretty, but I think that the idea that atheism is just an absence and a lack is not true. I think every person is trying to understand their existence, and I don't have any answers. I mean, I don't believe in a theistic God, but I'm open to everything else.
And your daughter, who we started off this conversation talking about, and who wanted to be a Catholic and have water thrown on her, and who wanted to go to a Catholic school, and who caused all of this angst for you. Where is your daughter at now in her religious journey?
It was quite a journey. She set up a cult briefly, but there was only one other cult member, so that didn't last long. But it was pretty impressive. It was called the Chickadoo. She ended up becoming a Wiccan. So she's 11 now, and this is years on. And I once again, I see myself in her. I think she's a kid who's really inquisitive about the world, and she does tend to look to the heavens. And so now she's a Wiccan, and I have to say, I'm pretty proud of that. I'm pretty impressed. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty left of field choice, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it suits her better. I think she wouldn't have coped very well with a lot of the Catholic ideas about so many things. So,
and do you think that she needs something like that in her life, or is there a playfulness about that?
I think it's the way she sees the world. And it's interesting because I've got two kids, and my son is so rational. My son is very lovely, and I always imagined that if he'd been Catholic, we would have thought he should be a priest because he's so sweet and kind and gentle, but very rational. And he's 3 years older than her, and it just doesn't make sense to him. And he doesn't see the world like that. But for her, I think she is looking to something, and it is just who she is. And I don't know whether she will continue with her Wiccan ways for many years more, but she may. But I think it is, some of us just, some of us look to the heavens more eagerly, I suppose.
And your extended Catholic family, which you're no doubt from, and who no doubt are going to read the book with interest, and who've obviously known, your views for a long time. How are they feeling about the fact that you've committed all of this to print?
That's another book, really. My brother, who I write about in the book, and he's very much the heart of much of what happens in the book. My brother Matthew, he's only up to chapter 3 or 4, I think. So, but he was wonderful when I was writing the book, and I think it was quite painful for him to have me write about a shared childhood and a whole lot of things that came with that. But So I don't know yet. I mean, I spoke to a lot of family when I was writing the book, which was really illuminating. But yeah, look, don't write a memoir. That was maybe just don't write a memoir.
I was speaking to a writer just the other night over dinner. I won't mention her name, who was talking about writing memoir as therapy, really, or as a way of kind of explaining to herself what had happened and coming to terms with it, really, I suppose. And hoping that obviously there's a readership for it as well. I get the feeling this has really been the same for you.
Yeah, it was a cleansing. I wouldn't say it was so much therapy, because I think I might end up in therapy after writing the book. But I did, I did feel I had to be brave, actually. And I always think it's Helen Garner. I think Helen, I don't want to misquote her here, but something about, you've got to have a little shard of glass in your heart. And I felt that I had to write a book that was truthful, and I wanted to be respectful. I hope I was respectful, but there were a lot of places I ended up going to that if you'd asked me before I'd started the book, I would have said, oh, no, I'll never write about that. But in the end, I felt I wanted to have a conversation with other lapsed Catholics and people who had left religion. And, I wanted to have a conversation that was truthful. And so I didn't pull as many punches as I expected I might have. But I mean, it's a high wire act. It's not easy doing that because there's so much that comes into it. But, so far the book hasn't been out for very long. And so far I haven't received any angry correspondence from people I know and love. So we'll see how we go with that.
I'll pass on the correspondence from the ABC in your direction when it comes, Monica. It's been a tremendous conversation, and it is a tremendous book about something I suppose we've all thought about, but you've dug very deeply. So congratulations, and thanks for joining us tonight in this terrific chat.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah. Emma Kate, I'll hand it back to you, and I don't know whether there are any questions from the audience. If not, I'll let you conclude the proceedings at Avid Reader.
Well, yeah, unfortunately, we're all out of time this evening, but thank you both so much. This has been such a phenomenal conversation. I really hope that everybody who has attended this evening has enjoyed it as much as I have. Please don't forget, I've posted the link that you can use to purchase your copies of Lapsed in the chat box for you to follow. And yes, thank you both so much, Monica and Paul. I hope everybody has a lovely evening.
Thanks, Emma Kate. Thanks, Paul.
Cheers.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
See ya.